stood in the rain outside the iron gates of the Blackwood estate, holding a single cardboard box that contained 35 years of my life. My brother Julian didn't even come down to say goodbye. He watched from the second-story library window, a silhouette framed by the warm glow of a fireplace I had spent my childhood cleaning. Beside him stood my sister Elena, her arms crossed, her face a mask of practiced indifference. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just looked at the wet gravel beneath my boots and realized that in the eyes of my own blood, I was no longer a person. I was a liability that had finally been liquidated. The engine of my rusted sedan groaned as I turned the key, the sound echoing off the stone walls that had belonged to our family for 4 generations. As I drove away, leaving behind the 3,000 acres of prime coastal timberland and the multi-million-dollar developmental rights, I caught a glimpse of my uncle, Silas, pulling into the driveway in his pristine silver coupe. He didn't wave. He didn't even look. He just drove past, already mentally measuring the square footage of the wing he intended to claim for himself. I was 42 years old, and for the first time in my life, I had nowhere to go. The silence in that car was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Our family wasn't built on love. It was built on acreage. My father, the patriarch of the Blackwood Timber Empire, had a saying, "Land doesn't lie, but people do." He spent his life ensuring the estate remained whole, a massive, contiguous sprawl of old-growth forest that was worth more as a single unit than as 1,000 divided plots. Julian, the eldest, was groomed for the throne. He was 50 now, a man of expensive suits and even more expensive insecurities. He lacked our father's grit but possessed double the greed. He viewed the estate as a scoreboard, a way to prove he was the titan he never quite became. He spent his days in the city, playing at high finance, while I stayed on the land, managing the crews, the soil, and the heritage. He envied my connection to the earth because it was the only thing he couldn't buy. Eleanor was the middle child, 46, a woman whose entire identity was curated through the lens of social standing. She had married a man named Thomas, a corporate lawyer with a shark's grin and a hollow heart. Eleanor didn't care about the timber. She cared about the prestige of the Blackwood name. To her, I was an embarrassment, the dirty brother who smelled of pine resin and diesel, the one who lived in the modest foreman's cottage instead of a penthouse. She wanted the estate sold, subdivided into luxury eco-resorts that would fund her lifestyle in the city for a century. Then there was Silas, my father's younger brother. At 64, he was the elder statesman of our ruin. He was the one who whispered in Julian's ear about streamlining the management. He was the one who convinced Elena that I was hoarding the family's liquidity by refusing to clear-cut the northern ridge. Silas had spent his life in his brother's shadow, waiting for the patriarch to die so he could finally step into the light. He didn't want the money as much as he wanted the power to exclude. The final piece of the puzzle was Thomas, Elena's husband. He was the architect of my exile. With a series of carefully drafted restructuring documents and a few forged signatures on an addendum to my father's will, they stripped me of my voting rights. They claimed I was mentally unstable, citing the reclusive nature of my life on the ridge. They didn't just take my job, they legally declared me a stranger to my own home. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office watching Thomas slide the papers across the mahogany desk. Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. Eleanor was checking her watch. Silas was smiling, a small, thin-lipped thing that made my skin crawl. "It's for the best, Arthur," Silas had said. "You've always been more comfortable with the trees than with people. This way you're free." I didn't sign the papers. I didn't have to. Thomas had already seen to it that the board, comprised of his own hand-picked associates, had outvoted me. I left that room without a word. I knew that if I spoke, I would give them the reaction they wanted. They wanted me to be the unstable brother. They wanted a scene. I gave them nothing but my back. For the next 5 years, I lived in a small rental 2 towns over. I took a job as a surveyor for the county. It was quiet, invisible work. I spent my days walking other people's boundaries, mapping out the lines where one person's dreams ended and another's began. I watched them from a distance. I didn't need to hire private investigators. The Blackwoods couldn't help but be public. Elena's social media was a constant stream of renovations at the estate. She was tearing out the old orchards to build a tennis court. Julian was featured in the business journals, touting the Blackwood expansion, a plan to turn the Northern Ridge into a massive commercial development. They were arrogant. They were moving too fast. They thought that because I was gone, the land had lost its voice. I spent my nights in the county records office. I knew every deed, every easement, and every water right associated with that property. My father had taught me that land is a living thing, governed by laws older than the men who claim to own it. I began to notice things. Small discrepancies in the filings Thomas had submitted for the development. A forgotten environmental easement on the northern ridge that my grandfather had signed in 1954 to avoid a massive tax lien. I didn't call the papers. I didn't file a lawsuit. I just waited. I waited for the exact moment their greed would exceed their reach. It happened in the 5th year. Julian had leveraged the entire estate to fund a massive development project. He had taken out hundreds of millions in loans, using the land as collateral. To satisfy the bank, he needed the Blackwood expansion to break ground by the end of the fiscal year. But there was a problem I had known about since I was 12 years old, watching my father argue with a surveyor in the rain. The Northern Ridge wasn't just land, it was the primary watershed for the 3 surrounding townships. And according to that 1954 easement, a document buried in a mislabeled box in the county basement, any commercial development on that ridge required the unanimous consent of all living heirs of the Blackwood line, including me. Thomas had tried to bury that easement during the restructuring, but he hadn't destroyed it. He couldn't. It was tied to a federal grant. He had simply gambled that I was too broken to look for it or too poor to fight it. I wasn't broken, and I wasn't fighting. I was just holding the thread. The collapse began with a single letter. I didn't send it to the family. I sent it to the lead bank financing Julian's development. It was a formal notice of interest, a simple 2-page document stating that as a legal heir, I had never consented to the development of the Northern Ridge, and therefore, the collateral for their $300 million loan was legally encumbered. The bank froze the funds within 48 hours. The dominoes didn't fall all at once. They tipped slowly, agonizingly. Julian was the first. Without the bank's funding, his expansion became a sinkhole. He had already signed contracts with construction firms and suppliers. The lawsuits started pouring in. He tried to sell off portions of the timberland to cover the debts, but he couldn't. The notice of interest acted like a poison in the soil. No one would buy land with a clouded title. I watched the news reports of his firm's bankruptcy. He looked 10 years older, his expensive suits hanging off a frame that had been hollowed out by stress. He called me once. I watched the phone ring on my kitchen table until it stopped. He didn't leave a message. He didn't have the words. Elena was next. She had invested her entire inheritance into Julian's project, convinced by Thomas that it was a sure thing. When the project stalled, Thomas's firm was implicated in the fraudulent filing of the development permits. The forged signatures they had used to push me out were suddenly under the microscope of a federal audit. Thomas didn't stay to fight. He took what liquidity he had left and moved to a country without an extradition treaty, leaving Elena with a mountain of debt and a reputation that was charred beyond recognition. She had to sell the estate's furnishings, the paintings, the silver, the history, just to keep the lights on in a house she could no longer afford to heat. I saw her at the grocery store once. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of rage and desperation. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to scream, perhaps to apologize. But I simply nodded, a polite stranger passing in the aisle, and kept walking. The look on her face wasn't triumph. It was the realization that I had become the ghost she always wanted me to be. Silas was the hardest to break because Silas didn't care about money. He cared about his legacy. He wanted to be the man who saved the Blackwood name. But as the legal fees mounted and the scandal grew, the board of the family foundation, the one he had spent decades cultivating, voted him out. They didn't want the Blackwood name anymore. It had become synonymous with fraud and familial betrayal. He ended up in a small assisted living facility, his wing of the estate never built, his stories of family greatness falling on the deaf ears of overworked nurses. He had spent his life trying to exclude me, only to find himself in a room where no one knew his name. It took 7 years in total. The estate eventually went into a court-ordered receivership. Because of the easement I had brought to light And because I was the only heir with a clean legal record and a demonstrated history of land management, the court appointed me as the primary conservator. I didn't get the money back. The Blackwood fortune was gone, consumed by lawyers, banks, and bad debts. But I got the land. I drove through the iron gates on a Tuesday afternoon. The driveway was overgrown with weeds. The house looked tired, its windows like cataract-filmed eyes. It was quiet. No construction crews, no socialites, no whispering uncles. I walked up to the northern ridge. The trees were still there. The water was still flowing through the rocks, indifferent to the fact that it had almost been paved over for a shopping mall. I sat on a stump and looked out over the 3,000 acres. I thought about the box I had carried out 7 years ago. I thought about my father's voice. Land doesn't lie. My family had tried to treat the earth like a ledger, and in return, the earth had swallowed them whole. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, never realizing that the loudest thing in the world is the truth waiting for its time. I don't feel like a victor. There are no trophies here. The house is a shell, and my siblings are strangers living in the wreckage of their own making. I am alone in a vast, empty kingdom. But as the sun began to set behind the ridge, casting long, peaceful shadows across the forest floor, I realized I could finally breathe. The air didn't smell like betrayal anymore. It just smelled like pine and coming rain. I stood up and started walking toward the foreman's cottage. I have work to do. The land has been neglected for too long, and I am the only one left who knows how to listen to it. Some people think revenge is a fire that consumes everything it touches, but real revenge is much quieter. It's the act of outlasting the people who tried to bury you, until you're the only one left to tell the story. I took a deep breath of the cold mountain air and smiled for the first time in a decade. The gates are locked, and for the first time in my life, I'm the only one with the key.